So thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are in the world. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Rebecca O'Hare, and I am going to be your moderator today, which I'm very excited about. I am the Head of Partnerships and Resident Experience with the Student First Group, and I'm based in Manchester in the northwest of the UK. Our topic today is going to look at global approaches to supporting staff, and that is staff and student staff as well. So hopefully you'll be covering a number of areas. Before we get going, just a little reminder that we have some wonderful resources online on the ACUHO-I website, so feel free to have a look at that. Also, all the previous webinars that we've held are on the YouTube channel, and don't hesitate to check out the forum as well. If you have any questions, big or small, about any topic, even if it's not COVID related, there'll be somebody online to help you and give you some assistance. Like I said to you, some wonderful panels today. I am going to let them introduce themselves. They are from Scotland in the UK and Qatar and Australia. So I'm going to get the hand over to them, and I feel like doing a very res life thing and doing an icebreaker, but I won't do that to them today. Instead, I'm going to ask them to talk a bit about their role, who they are, their institution, and maybe give a little lay of the land of where they're at right now. So I'll hand over to Christopher, and then we'll go to Matthew in Qatar, and then Marion in Australia.
Hi there. Good morning from Edinburgh. It's 8 in the morning here, so we're doing a lot better than some of you who may be up late at night. My name is Christopher Tucker. I'm the Director of Residence Life at the University of Edinburgh. At the moment, we still have 4,500 students in residence, so we're fully operational, albeit remotely. We've got a full complement. I say full complement, we've got a reduced number of RAs and a full number of professional staff, but we've moved our entire service remotely and been working a lot of projects that I'm sure we'll speak about throughout the course of this. But people are doing well. It's a struggle, as you know. Students are surviving, and some are thriving, and we're trying to keep them up to the thriving level. But yeah, no, we still have a fairly large segment of our population still in residence that we're looking after until our lockdown ends.
Great.
And Matthew, how about you in Qatar?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hello, my name is Matt Nelson. I'm the Head of Residence Life here for Qatar Foundation Student Housing in Doha, Qatar. It is 10 a.m. here, I guess we'll on Thursday. So we'll, for those of you that are in the US, this is the future. We're a day ahead. Happy to be here and to kind of share. We are in a transition here. So my role is over Residence Life primarily, but also working with the facilities to a certain extent and an emergency response. We are in between right now terms. So we just transitioned from what is our second term into our summer term, which is kind of the interim before we start the new academic year. We're down about 50% in terms of our occupancy. But our challenge is a little unique this year, is that we have a lot of students, because of the large number of international students that we have, that aren't able to go home. Either those that are planning to continue in the next academic year, or those that just recently graduated. And so our occupancy is looking a little bit different this year as we try to support them as throughout, and then anticipate what's going to happen when we have new students potentially coming in as well. But everything's remaining virtual at this point.
And Marion, how about you over in lovely Australia?
Yeah, so it's 5 p.m. Thursday, so we're even more in the future here in Australia. Sun's just going down, and it's pretty chilly in Melbourne. But yeah, we are in a situation slightly different, I guess, to the other areas of the globe, whereby our schedule is very different here in Australia. So we have gearing up for the end of our first semester, or first half of the year, into our second, as our academic year does flow from the end of January, February time period through, so a little bit different to your September to September. So it's been a very interesting start to this year for us. At Deakin, which is my day job, I guess, I'm General Manager for Deakin Residential Services here in Victoria. We actually gave a directive to students that could go home to go home. That directive was given back in March, and we had seen our our occupancy dropped to about 30%, predominantly international students that could not go home, or interstate students that could not go across borders of our states in Australia. So much lower occupancy. We actually have combined 2 campuses into one for accommodation in Geelong, in that area of our business. So been some challenging times, but we are very lucky in this corner of the world. I see Jacob's here from New Zealand watching too, and we have managed to control a fair amount of this impact. So we are looking at really opening doors, and some places have already done that, into what that looks like in a new space for COVID, and managing kind of social distancing, but in much more of a capacity around the 80-90% mark. So we seem to be a little bit on the up, which is great.
Wonderful. So many questions I want to ask already. So a couple of housekeeping issues before we really get stuck into the juicy bits and pieces about today's session. So it's very much conversation based, as you've probably already seen, not a traditional webinar. It's an opportunity to connect and be part of that conversation as well. And you, as an audience member, can post questions to the audience. So if there's something on your mind and something you would like an answer on, don't hesitate to send your question via the Q&A button on the Zoom menu. If you hover over your screen, you see that at the bottom. When you do so, just state your name, position, institution, and the question that you have, and we'll give you a little shout out. We may type back to you and ask you to read it out, or we'll read the question on your behalf. So the more questions, the better. So back to us. I am going to kick things off with the first question, and I am going to start with Christopher, if that's okay, over in Bonnie, Scotland. Looking at professional staff, Christopher, how do you determine essential versus non-essential staff? Because obviously, you know, there's this kind of conversation that, oh, universities are closed and we're not doing any work, but actually a lot of staff are still at their institution and working and supporting all those students that you just spoke about. How have you determined who's essential and who's non-essential and who needs to be there?
Well, I think within our unit, it's been very easy because we've all been essential. Our entire team is still producing content when it comes to social programming. We're still reaching out to students with remote welfare assessments. And a very small core of us are still going out and visiting students that are in distress, aren't in contact with us, and you know, when we have a bit of a void of communication, there are moments when we have had to go and knock on doors and see people in person. So so we've kept everyone on within our unit. The remaining residential assistants as well who stayed with us, again, are producing content for our social programming and reaching out to students remotely. So it's been a very easy decision with that, as we've all been essential. I mean, I think technically, if you look at the essential element of that when it comes to the UK, there's a legal connotation that allows you to travel. So we've only got 2 or 3 people on that list, but that would be the people that would be tasked with intervening in welfare cases that were quite intense or extreme distress of the student.
Okay, great. And Marion, if I can ask you the same question as well, and then I'll go over to Matthew. How have you determined who are essential and non-essential staff in your department?
Yeah, very similar actually. I mean, I think most of us do run fairly lean ships as a normal business anyway, and we would all find that pressure is there. So for us, you know, student accommodation, particularly in this region, is deemed an essential service because we do have students that still need to be housed and looked after. So from our perspective, it was less about essential versus non-essential as far as standing down or following staff, but more around essential versus non-essential to be on campus and present versus working from home. And so that was much more of the project that happened in the early days, and what we're still working with now. Like, you know, campus life staff or resident life staff are able to remotely do welfare calls, etc., as spoken about, and our digital programming. But there is that need we run a 24-hour reception on campus, and that's remained in place at all of our facilities as that triaging and on-site support that we have. So yeah, it was more determining who had to be on site in order to maintain their roles.
Okay, and Matthew, what's the scene like over in Qatar?
Yeah, I think some similarities between what has been shared. I think it was thinking about essential of what needs to happen in person and who needs to be on campus. And so for us, it was, we tried to move as many things as we could to be virtual. So even our front desk has been virtual, but maintenance, dining, things you would expect, security have all obviously remained on site. But we've tried to move as many things as we can to virtual. I think one thing that we've done as well for our staff as we anticipate, as Christopher mentioned, welfare checks or crisis situations, having a 2 to 3 week, we started with 2 week, now a 3 week kind of rotation of who will respond on scene if needed, and trying to keep, like, here's the core group that will go in, and if needed, and if not, and then we'll kind of switch that so that we're not all, I guess we're anticipating, we don't want to knock everybody out if someone were to come down with coronavirus and then the whole team is quarantined. And that's been helpful as well. But really our goal has been to minimize operations to a certain extent. Oops, lost my mic there. Minimize operations as much as we can and make things virtual, and keeping it that way, because in terms of where we are country-wise is definitely still within our peak of new infections.
Okay, and I mean, you've all mentioned the word pressure and, staff members having to change their roles slightly. And obviously these are, I'm going to say the word, unprecedented times. This has an impact, no doubt, on staff well-being. And there's a huge, probably, pressure on some of you guys or on your shoulders to maintain staff morale. Is there anything in particular you've all been doing or that you've found that it works that you'd like to share? I'll go back over to Christopher for that and then go to Matthew and Marion.
Yeah, Rebecca, I don't think we're going to have to find a new word rather than hyperbole, because it just doesn't exist anymore. So I think your global pandemic is probably good enough to encapsulate what we're going through. Yeah, no, I think, and you're going to have to repeat part of the question for me, though. I just missed out. You cut out just a little bit.
So we're just looking at staff morale, and obviously this is a difficult time for staff and students. A lot of pressure on your shoulders to keep your team motivated. What kind of things have you been doing to keep morale up?
Yeah, a lot of it has been contact. We've been doing a lot of one-to-ones. We've had some team meetings, again, virtual. We have a coffee every week together, and that's part of it. I mean, I think we have to remember, especially for our live-in staff, the levels and the feelings of peril are much more heightened from people that are walking outside the door every day and are in a more contaminated environment. And that's a lot of our team, and we've got staff that are trying to shield and have loved ones at home and have their own pressures. And so I think managing those groups is increasingly difficult on oneself, but also on those kind of living it every day. I lived in, well, other than the last year, I lived in for about 20 years. So this is the first time I've been released into the wild. But to kind of walk outside your door and be at work, especially during a global pandemic, I think the impact can't be overstated. It really can't be. So with that, and obviously it's Mental Health Week, and we've been doing things around kindness. And the thing I've been really reinforcing to everyone is that getting through each day is a victory. What we've just accomplished over the last 2 months is heroic, and it may not be online with the NHS or other institutions, but it is heroic, and everyone should be really proud of themselves of what they've done in the last couple of months, and it's ongoing. So, and I think that's the important part of this. And I think when we spoke previously, I talked about it being the creeping crisis. It's just seems to get closer and closer, and then ebb away, and then get closer and closer. And so I think when you're talking to your staff and when you're engaging with them and you're having these one-to-ones or you're trying to support them, is to remember that this isn't over. This is an ongoing level of anxiety and pressure. So thinking about finish lines and things like that are really nice, but really we've got to think about just getting through this day. So we've been really focusing on day-to-day involvement, improvement, self-care, looking after each other, reaching out to each other, and that's really the focus we've had. And we've rewarded some of our staff financially, and although it's been in small increments, I think that's really important as well if you have the capacity to do so.
And I love that you mentioned, staff members who are potentially living in. Did that myself for 5 years. It's not easy, and there'll be many people watching today from different parts of the world who do live in as part of their role, and so it's a heightened sense or another level of pressure within the role during these times. Matthew, how about in Qatar? How are you maintaining staff morale, and how's that worked out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I appreciate what Christopher talked about. I mean, this is such a, I'm going to have to say unprecedented as well. It just, because of the extent of it and the duration of it, because I think for so many crises, I think as student housing, as residence life, it's something that we excel in, but usually it is contained. Maybe it's a few days, maybe it's a week, it might stretch a little bit longer, but those impacted typically are confined to a few individuals. You know, I think this is so unique because we're all impacted in different ways, and it stretches everywhere and it's ongoing. So I think what we found helpful is acknowledging that with the team, but having regular contact. And so we do, at first it was daily with all of our student staff, kind of town halls essentially, but just to have them all there. You know, it was information sharing at a basic level, but also it was just hearing what their concerns were, what their anxieties, helping them to feel empowered, I think helped their morale because they were kind of armed with knowledge and information and resources, and we were able to respond more quickly, I think, by, you know, understanding that on the ground experience, because very quickly this was like mid-March, all the professional staff left. And so, you know, we rely heavily on student staff as our live-in staff, not only on the floors, but also as the kind of the resident director, RA supervisor level as well. And so it was really important to connect with them virtually, one-on-one, on a regular basis. And I think just making sure that they have that time and space with us as support. And then the other thing I think, and this is for everybody, for all of our team and us as professionals, is because it is ongoing, kind of the permission to take a break, that and building in that time. So, you know, like, you know, this block of time or this day, unless it's all hands on deck, we don't want you to respond. Take time for yourself, focus on what you need to. And we've been trying to do that for ourselves also, although probably to a less successful extent. But I think that's really important so that so people aren't burning out, and that's been really helpful for our team.
I think permission to take a break is really powerful and really, really important. And Marion, how about your team? How is morale going? I know the structure of the academic year is slightly different in Australia. Maybe that makes a difference right now, maybe not, but how have you been doing with your team?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it is in a slightly different phase. I think there's been a lot more around balancing homeschooling. That seems to be a big issue for professional staff that are trying to manage full-time load remotely as well as schooling. So that's been part of that balance. And I guess echoing what Matt said, allowing people that time is now the right time for you to take some leave and be present in your home life and build that up. One of the things we've done quite effectively here, and again, it's a different scenario probably slightly, but it is a student feedback, because, you know, all of us are driven ultimately in this industry by the students that we serve and the residents that we have in our halls. And I think when you start to hear their stories about how your institution has made a difference during this time, it's super powerful to share that with your professional staff and just give them that sense of value about what they're doing. We talk a lot about gratefulness, and there's a lot of opportunities. As I said, we actually had to close fully down a 24-hour operation of one of our campuses and integrate that into another to combine resources. And at that time had to ask staff to voluntarily look at what works best for them as far as you know, time fractions, adjusting time shift allowances, etc. And it's actually been really positive. The opportunity is there, and we've just surveyed them about, even when we're back to normal with both back and up and running, do some of them want to continue that because it's actually worked for them in their lives or their home life? So giving them opportunity to see this as a chance to not just turn back on to what was the normal that we did know, and take the positives wherever we can out of what we've gone through over the last 3 months. So that's been a real focus for us too.
That's brilliant, because I think that's happened for all of us in our roles. You know, this pandemic has shown us, you know, before we thought we couldn't work from home or we couldn't, you know, engage online. Like virtual communities wasn't really a thing in res life, and now that's going to be brought forward. So that is the positive for me anyway to bring out. Now, the great thing is we've got a question from one of our audience members, from Stephen Kuras. I hope I pronounced that properly, Stephen. And he is over in Philadelphia. So thank you for getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning. I do appreciate that. He's the Director of Residence Life at the Curtis Institute of Music. And he is curious as to what you're all doing now and what you'll be doing in the summer in preparation for the fall for move-in and orientation. How are you preparing? So I'm going to put a little spin on that, because I assume he's asking about staff, because obviously you have resident assistants starting and maybe that's changing slightly. So I know Christopher in Edinburgh has a lot of resident assistants, over 200. So if I start with you, Christopher, and then I'll mix it up. I'll go to Marion afterwards and then go to Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. We've been doing a lot of work. I mean, we were kind of refocusing some of our attention on how we delivered our service anyway prior to the crisis, and so we've kind of set up our team into different project groups previously. Some of them were pre-existing, but we created a communications and digital strategy project leader with one of our residential life coordinators. So that was already in process. We hadn't started it yet, so COVID actually helped us refocus and really drive us forward. We have that. We have a training element of those projects. We've got health and well-being. We've also got our social programming, and we're trying to interlink all those and create these strategies. And as I said, so within a month, I think we'd redesigned our entire service so that we were delivering all of our social programming remotely. So, I mean, that was the first stage. But as far as for going into this, September is what we're working towards as we are going to open in September. But we've already started planning on how we, arrivals weekend will be shifting to arrivals week. So we're looking at a phased move-in over 5 days, a contactless as much as possible key collection. So we've actually gone through some of the buildings and really defined, what it would look like, one-way entry systems going out, exit another way, really thin on the ground, having information desks away from the main desk to avoid pinch points and crowding. And so there's been a lot of work that, especially my deputy Cheryl has been doing with our operations team, with our campus support security team. So we are looking at that, and I think all of these things, and when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to training, RA training, I think we're almost having to plan two strategies. So we have to have something sitting in a box so that if we are able to have more physical contact, we can engage and go back to maybe an in-between place between what we did in the past and now. But also we are having to prepare as if we would have to deliver our entire service remotely going forward, and arrivals weekend and social distancing and all that. So we are preparing based on the guidelines we have now, but we also are aware that those may change next week or the week after.
Okay. And Marion, obviously in Australia, your orientation week is in January, if I'm correct.
February, yeah, bit of a way off for us.
Yeah, a bit of a way off, but I imagine those conversations are probably starting to happen.
Yeah, they are. And look, we have a very unique student leadership model here at Deakin, which is very different to most in Australia and New Zealand in this region, whereby they are volunteers. They're not paid, so they're not on a staff as such. 90% of those are now off campus due to us giving that directive, but we still maintain all of those residents that moved in with us. So started this academic year in February are still connected via our social medias, and we're still delivering programming, even though technically they're no longer residents, just to maintain that engagement and maximise the return to residents, hopefully, for this second semester, and also that connection between those residential leaders and the rest of the cohort. So there is a lot of work going on in that space. We're not really sure what recruitment and training will look like. It will be pending that second trimester coming back to some form of access. But I guess we're looking at things around, we all do presentations pre-departure to international cohorts and things like that already. How do we translate that into domestic returns onto campus? And we are talking about, them having to sign additional agreements on top of what would normally be residential tenancies agreements in regards to adhering to government regulation and COVID social distancing spaces. As Chris mentioned, cleaning, contactless check-in, all of those processes that actually need to be in place for them to get back onto campus and to continue to manage. So those conversations are certainly happening. As far as orientation and what that looks like for 21, we are hoping that by the time we hit February, there is a little bit more of a hybrid normal rather than it being predominantly digital and contactless. So
great. And how about you, Matthew? How are you and your team preparing for the next intake?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think the word of the moment is contingency, because I think we have to prepare for all the eventualities. I think our setting is a little bit unique in that it's Qatar Foundation has member institutions, so there are 9 universities that we provide housing to, and each of them are making determinations about what next term is going to look like, whether that'll be virtual, whether they'll be in person. And I think there's obviously a collaborative push to have that be the same across the board, but we also anticipate there might be variations to that. And so, we're getting ready for what that means for each of those different student populations. within our housing. I think our challenge will be kind of welcoming the new students in, especially if the peak kind of continues as it is, because we'll likely have to quarantine incoming students, especially because the majority of students that live in housing, probably about 80–85%, are international students. And so if they're coming from external to Qatar, then they would need to quarantine for a time period. So almost building that into the arrival prior to orientation, prior to classes starting, and incorporating that within the buildings. So a lot of our focus now is just on how will that be logistically, kind of balancing that with all of the students that left once instruction moved to virtual in March. We had students that were able to leave, chose to leave and just kind of left their things behind, planning to come back in the fall. So kind of trying to figure out where everybody will come into the rooms and how they need to do that is occupying us right now. We'll probably know more as we get into July, maybe end of June, in terms of what the universities are doing, and then that will set our direction from there.
Okay, wonderful. We've had two more questions come in from our audience members. One from Jacob, who I know is in the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Kia ora, hope I pronounced that properly, Jacob. And another similar one from Rebecca, who's in Rome in Italy, so buongiorno to Rebecca. Again, I don't speak Italian. And they are asking questions around RA hiring and training for your next cohort. And essentially, are you going to change your training in future in light of this event? Does it make you look at recruitment differently? So for example, are you going to incorporate information on pandemics and how to handle those in training sessions? And I think I put this question to Christopher and Matthew, because I know, Marion, you're still not thinking about that yet because it's quite a way off. So Christopher, are you thinking about changing your RA training and including pandemic training?
Yeah, well, again, as we're already working, we've been working on dynamic risk assessment protocols that we'd had previously, and we kind of did a pop-out version of those to respond, and how we respond to the current crises, and how we engage with students. But really, and I think that, again, as I said, this escalated our opportunity to re-examine what we were doing previously. So when we're looking at training, we've really picked it apart, and really, I mean, it's really eye-opening, I think, because I think we get really relaxed in how we approach things, and get this traditional kind of training model that we have done for years, and then you kind of forget to re-examine what is essential. And so this has been a fantastic opportunity to look at what is actually essential, especially when we think of this training week, and does it need to be a week? You know, we've been looking at micro training sessions, pop-out training, to really, bookend what would be thought of as a traditional training week. So we've looked at everything that we could possibly do that might be pre-training, that could be done in pre-arrival, that could be done digitally, that could be reinforced that week. We've been looking through that week specifically, and whether it's a week or 3 or 4 days or 2 weeks, as some people may have. We really focus on what do they need to know the day students arrive. What is the essential key elements, and how do we make sure that narrative fits into, a student arriving, they ask me a question, I do this, where do I look for the information, who do I respond? And it's really how we use this information practically. And then throughout the year, we're looking at doing, again, a number of micro sessions to reinforce the training that we've done. So thinking of it less of a training week, and that it's continuous training throughout the year is really what we're going to focus on. And with that, we're looking at the technology that we have to either provide, as Marion said, a hybrid model, or something that looks a bit more traditional. But really, it's really helped us kind of refocus our training and delivery in general.
Great. And Matthew, how about you? Any considerations to how you might deliver staff for RA training and recruitment in light of all this? And I'm going to add a little additional question to that, because I'm conscious that Rebecca asked a little bit more detail. She's also asked, how will training for hands-on type of things like first aid be approached? And is there any consideration to that?
Yeah. So I think so. Our recruitment happened in February, and so I think that's kind of typically our timeline is to hire for the coming academic year, starting in August and February. And so we have our staff already selected for the coming year. I think, though, what we're looking at is just the nature of the position has changed. I think even our student staff, who we would probably categorize as digital natives, we're kind of surprised, or it was a challenge to connect with students, not because they didn't know how, but because of the Zoom fatigue and other online, trying to complete parts of their role in a virtual space. And so I think our training will really look at how can we do that effectively. I think we might have some gaps in that, our selection is really geared toward hiring students who are good at in-person interactions, facilitating in-person events, connecting with people in that space, and looking at what kind of new skills, new training do we need to add to kind of reinforce the virtual space, anticipating that will at least continue in part during the coming year. And so, I think that'll be a lot of our focus. And kind of to Christopher's point, I think this has been a great opportunity for us to look at the training that we do provide. Does it need to be at that certain amount of time? Can we break it up differently? I think the biggest challenge is going to be, I think the pandemic happened at a good time in the sense that our staff was fully formed. It was obviously the second term. They knew each other well. We'll have a new staff coming in, lots of new staff members. How do we build that team virtually when we lean on those in-person interactions so much during training? A lot of training, this always comes up with returning staff of, do I have to come to training again? And we always say yes. They're like, but I know the content. You're like, well, yes, you know the content, but this is about team building. This is about getting to know your team and connecting. And the biggest question in my mind, we were just talking about this yesterday, is how can we effectively do that and really gel this team together in the virtual space? So I know that's where our focus will be.
Yeah, Matthew, I always remind my RAs that I've been through training for about 25 years. So, so it's,
Exactly.
Sorry to all the RAs out there. But yeah, so, but I just want to comment quickly on the first aid element. And I think it goes back to, when I mentioned dynamic risk assessments, and all dynamic risk assessments are really is the cyclical idea of thinking about the level of risk to you in any situation. So, and we've put that into a protocol, and we've looked at the issues surrounding how we might respond to someone who maybe have a suspected case of COVID-19. It'd be the same situation. Is the area safe for you to enter and provide help? Do you have the appropriate equipment? And so that's what we've been really looking at. We've been working closely with our health and safety team about levels of PPE depending on engagement. And some of those levels are going to be quite high, almost to the level of home care workers when it comes to a distressed student that we're having difficulty contacting and the engagement that may entail when we're doing that room check versus somebody. And I think this was the topic that we were discussing is, what does a security team do with an intoxicated student now? In the past, we would have put them in the recovery position. We would have engaged with them, possibly called an ambulance. And so how does that look in the age of being worried about an infection? And so we are still teasing out some of those questions, but we are looking at in the guise of dynamic risk assessments.
Amazing. What I love from the conversation so far from all of our panelists is that, the positive things that have come out of this is such a wonderful trait of student housing professionals, I think, generally. We have another great question on our Q&A section from Adrina in the university, and I hope I pronounced this properly, University of Wollongong in Australia. I love that name. And she is talking about a return to campus for staff, because a lot of us obviously are working from home. And so that raises different types of considerations. So transport, rearranging office spacing, working remotely and who gets to still work remotely, cleaning regimes, supply of hand sanitizer, and so much more. And she's interested to hear if others are in this space and what's happening. Marion, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you, and then I'll pop over to Matthew and Christopher.
Yeah, so probably in a similar vein to Edwina being in Australia at the same point, I guess, from a external influence perspective and government regulation type scenario. So we are planning to return to campus activations fairly quickly, probably in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So yeah, those conversations are being had. I think there will be an element for some time that some roles that are certainly not student facing or a requirement will continue to work from home to allow for that social distancing and capacity space within administration buildings. Also looking at potentially not doubling over with campus life staff in multi-layers and reception staff covering shifts, etc. So yeah, I think there's a bit of planning to do in that, and I don't think that will return to everyone just coming back to work and resuming their desk on desk in office spaces. So a little bit of structure around what that looks like. Obviously there's certain roles, as we talked about, that are already determined, like maintenance, that have to be on site. So, you know, they're already here and will continue to do so. It's going to be a staggered approach from our perspective. In regards to the student leaders, they will get priority back on campus in order to maintain that engagement. So they will be inside, and then we are determining whether we can actually occupy shared facilities at 100% capacity, or we need to cap that in order to maintain social distancing, bathroom ratios, cleaning schedules, etc. So so there is a bit of work in that space. But from a professional staff point of view, I think for the remainder of this year, we will see some people, if not full-time working from home, swapping in and out, and on that kind of roster environment to limit the number of people in confined office spaces.
Okay. And Matthew, how about Qatar? What's your approach at the moment?
Yeah. So I imagine that so there's a number of things that we did, I think, that were helpful and that will continue, particularly with our contractor staff. So with our maintenance, cleaning, as well as dining staff. And so we've been lucky that we have other spaces within Qatar Foundation we've been able to use, including some within student housing in some unoccupied buildings, to have the staff actually live on campus. And so that's been very helpful, just to ensure, particularly so that it's kind of contained within the community, and so that we don't kind of get that outside exposure to coronavirus. And so I imagine that will continue. But I think in addition to that is really looking at kind of where staff are gathering, where they're clustered, and really rethinking that, because we do have offices and contractors all kind of coming together, checking in a smaller space and looking at where else can we do that. We've reduced the staff, obviously, and are only doing kind of the emergency maintenance, but at some point the planned preventative maintenance and the regular maintenance will need to occur, and figuring out a way to do that doesn't increase the risk as much as possible. But similar to Marion, I believe that we'll continue virtually, particularly for those that don't need to come in, at least into what's the fall in the Northern Hemisphere, into the first term, and continuing that. I think we're lucky in terms of the structure of our buildings that they do lend themselves to physical distancing, as well as the student rooms in terms of single occupancy, but looking at those maybe problematic areas where that isn't the case.
Okay, excellent. And Christopher, how about you? I'm sure there's some similarities from Matthew and Marion, but what's the scene in Edinburgh?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say Marion and Matthew covered it. I mean, if my team are watching, they're going to be excited to know what we're doing. And we've not come to those conclusions as of yet. We've got a very small office. You know, we're looking at everything. We're looking at, you know, rotation, week on, week off, people working from home, working in, possible, you know, physical barriers at work, how we can spread out. We're looking at every kind of nook and cranny around our Pollock campus to see what rooms are free, disused meeting rooms, you know. So yeah, so we're all over it. I don't say that we have a specific plan as of yet, but we, you know, people are, it's like everywhere. I mean, you know, everyone's ready to work and do something, you know. So it's not from a lack of will, but we just need to think very carefully about how we do that and how we proceed.
And something else, sorry, just to jump in on that I touched on previously, you know, that opportunity we've had of changing people who traditionally work Monday to Friday as an administrative support role and now working, you know, Sunday to Thursday or Tuesday to Saturday, maintaining that opportunity, which not only benefits the organisation because we're getting proper 24/7, 7 days a week coverage, but also allowing that flexibility of movement of staff. So I think there is opportunity there around looking outside of the standardized, these are normal hours, obviously under your enterprise agreements or whatever else is in play, but there is opportunity there, I think, to push the box a little bit in that space.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Marion, because I was thinking about this the other day, and it's like, you know, 9 to 5 means so little to Res Life teams, you know. Yeah. So it's you know, it's kind of like, yeah, okay. You know, for many of our people we work with, that's the thing. But yeah, so I think that flexibility is already kind of interwoven into what we do. But yeah, no, I think putting that kind of in a part of the planning is probably essential going forward.
Absolutely. We've got another question that was spotted in the chat from Carney, who I know works in the University Arts London. So good morning, Carney. And he's asking a question about Zoom fatigue, which is probably something we never really talked about before, pre-COVID. And so he's asking the question in regard to virtual engagement. So UAL, if you don't know them, have a great RAS Life Student Experience Programme. So he's asking, how can we overcome this in regards to events but other virtual activities? Christopher, is this something that's come up in conversations with your resident assistants or with your team, and how are you overcoming this?
Well, I mean, I'm getting headphone rash, so I don't know if that's universal. But
that sounds like a medical condition, Christopher.
Yeah, no, I know. I have to have that checked out. And UAE's been doing some remarkable work, and I just wanted to give them a shout out. Like, fantastic, really creative stuff, and we're hot behind your heels. But yeah, so. Yeah, no, I think it is a thing. Obviously, people are concerned about screen times. Those of us with children are obviously concerned with our own children's screen times, which have gone through the roof. So I'm sure there's going to be some fatigue, and I think that's why a good mix of when people are allowed out and when people do go to their physical activity, we incorporate that in some of the messaging, so that we want to entice them back indoors to be a part of our digital and social media community, but we really want to really push them to get outside and get some sunshine and exercise and engage as much as they can, socially at a distance. So I think that is a thing, and I think it'll be something that we need to really be conscious about, going forward, and especially, and I'd say this especially in the context of everyone's digital life is cultivated, and so it's so easy to look at someone exercising every day and thinking, oh my God, I've just lied in bed eating crisps, so putting that pressure on them. So I think that's, more than the screen fatigue, it's more the, you just have this little snapshot into someone's life, and we've framed our things to show this part of our moment and what we're doing, and just realizing that people are all having their own struggles kind of personally, and that this isn't indicative that everyone's having a good time and they're flat on their own.
And Marion, I can see you shaking your head there in agreement. How is that manifested over in Australia with your team?
Yeah, same. I mean, I think I've had numerous conversations this week. And when you're on the call, caught me, I just feel like we're just in back-to-back meetings online far more than we were in person. So I think from a staffing perspective, a decision we've been batting around over the last couple of days here at Deakin is about, meetings that were traditionally an hour that then just go into another one. You're missing that in between. Kind of, you would never book yourself into back-to-back meetings if you physically had to walk 5 minutes across campus or take someone for a coffee. So let's incorporate that and only book 45-minute meetings, and make sure in that 15 minutes you get out of your desk and you go and get a coffee or you do what you need to do. From a student perspective, I guess it's just shifting, like you said, Chris, focus on that outdoor stuff that we can do. We're doing step challenges with our resis because they are permitted to go out for exercise purposes at the moment. So, actually driving some of those challenges that encourage that to get away from just everything being Kahoot, Zoom, and all those other wonderful platforms that we've become so fond of.
And what about you, Matthew? How's it been in Qatar around Zoom fatigue? Are you experiencing it right now on this webinar?
No, this is the first one today, so this is good. So I'm Zoom fresh for the morning, but very similar to what was shared. I think we've been looking at just, what does kind of have the energy and the feeling of, Zoom does take a level of engagement and a level of attention, as opposed to maybe some other online activities that are that don't require that. And so we've been looking at, how are we engaging with students? We don't necessarily need to do staff meetings on Zoom. Can we do them on WhatsApp? Could we do them via chat, where it is, especially if it's just information sharing, so there isn't the need for face-to-face, and then dedicating that time where it is Zoom or whatever video chat to just the informal check-in, hangout, the kinds of things I think, Marion, as you're talking about. I mean, the informal interactions that really build relationships in from a staff team perspective, but also with residents as well. How can we build those in a way that doesn't seem kind of formal and scheduled and all of that? And so thinking about even, well, I don't think House Party is no longer isn't available in Qatar anymore, but I think there's some security issues with the platform. But looking at things like that, where I'm thinking about my 14-year-old daughter, they just leave it on, and it's kind of like your friends are hanging out with you, and you're just kind of talking, doing other things, and that they're there. And so trying to incorporate those elements, which for me is outside the box. I'm like, why would you just leave it on? That's very odd. You walk away from the screen. I don't understand. But it seems to connect with digital natives a bit more, where it isn't just maybe this is Christopher kind of taking off on what you're saying, the curated image that people might put forward on different platforms. Maybe that's a way to have that informal hangout where you come as you are, and creating spaces where that can occur.
Excellent. I know I had a little bit of Zoom fatigue myself yesterday, but I'm okay. I'm over it now. I am going to direct the question, the conversation a little bit, because I think this is an important question and one that people will be curious to know an answer to. And so the question is, what's been the impact on student staff role compensation and whether that's changed for you? Obviously, some of you recruit people who are not in paid positions. So Marion said their leaders are volunteers. But Christopher, has there been a change on compensation? Has that been altered in any way in Edinburgh?
Yeah, so we had a number, I think, for the UK, we kind of break it down, or at least in my mind, I break it down in kind of pre university classes stopping and post, because we had a weekend after it was announced that classes would no longer be held, when we had about 6,000 students leave over the course of 3 or 4 days. So that flight was obviously quite impactful for our team in managing the stress of 11,000 students as they tried to book flights all across the world. So of those who stayed, we did provide some extra compensation for the students who stayed, and we've reassessed as far as allowing people out of their lease, and this was even pre the 28 days notice that most of the UK adopted. And so we've looked at managing staff as well, RAs and specifically who need to stay on during the summer, making sure that they're housed and looked after. So they did kind of they did get a bonus bump in pay, but we've not increased pay going into the next year. But what we have really done is looked at what service they're providing and how they're providing it, and I think that's really the balance. And I know this is a big topic across the world at the moment is residential assistant compensation, and I think it's really it's mission creep is a thing, and I think for RAs, for everyone, it just because the RAs will do it or the RAs will do it, and I think it's just being really careful about that, especially now, because they are the ones that are more likely to be on social media, and then how we put boundaries around that to ensure that they're not acting over and beyond what's being asked of them, so that they're looking after themselves personally. So it is a balancing act, and then obviously we've got the financial impact of this crisis and managing that aspect of it. So we're looking at all of that, but I think regardless of how you compensate your residential assistants, residential advisors, whatever you call them, I think it's really making sure that they're getting one, value for money for the work they're doing, but also there's boundaries around the work they're doing, and they're heavily supported through this crisis, as they should be always.
And Matthew, I'm not sure if the setup in your institute in Qatar, are your RAs paid, and has that changed at all?
They are paid. It has not changed. I think we've kind of looked at it from the other end of lots of resources are being dedicated to supporting students during this time, and that will inevitably lead to budget cuts and the need to reduce in some areas. I think we've been advocating and have been successful in kind of protecting the student staff, student employment more broadly, not just the RAs, but the front desk staff as well. And finding that to be really important because of the financial impact on students, their families worldwide, not only to maintain their employment, but to maintain the compensation level. And that's continued through the second term and then now into the summer here. I think though, as we move forward, really looking at staffing levels then, and we need to reduce, depending, like we would normally do if we had fewer residents, we wouldn't need as many staff, having already hired staff and trying to find, do we repurpose them? Do we continue the compensation the same if we do repurpose them? So lots of considerations just in terms of that. But I think our underlying philosophy though is really wanting to support them as much as we can and to create student employment opportunities, just knowing how important that is for them, for many to be able to continue with their academics and their coursework.
Marion, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Obviously, you've got a different makeup in your department.
Yeah, so they are volunteers. They do receive a rental subsidy. So those that have remained on campus are still continue to receive that just to cover them across as they're still doing stuff. But as I said, most of ours are off campus, technically not even residents, let alone residential leaders, but are still voluntarily acting in that space for us, which is amazing. So for us, it's about the relationship with them, maintaining that. They get extra shout outs. They still have weekly RL meetings that they're voluntarily able to turn up to, just to maintain that engagement with them and hopefully get them back onto campus as quickly as possible. So yeah, for us, it's just keeping them warm and feeling really connected to us as an organisation.
I just wanted to add on to that a little bit, Rebecca. Yeah, and Marion, I appreciate you bringing that up, kind of that remote position. And so, you know, we do have staff, as I mentioned, that are outside of Qatar, may not be able to come back in, but looking at if engagement is in the virtual space, to what extent can we have student employees that are interacting in that virtual realm? And then obviously needing on-site staff as well, just for crisis management, but that might be a new kind of offshoot kind of position or role that will fill out a bit more to make it more robust, but there might be a need to do that as well, especially when we think about kind of that ratio of residents to RAs, and how does that change? You know, typically, you know, there's a kind of a benchmark of around 35, I guess, depending. It could go up, you know, obviously to 50 or something like that. But when we're talking about welfare and connecting and making sure people are okay, does that lower? Does it need to? What's reasonable for them in their roles?
Could I say as well, Matthew? And I think that's, you know, I think you're absolutely spot on there. You know, and I think we, you know, not only looking at capacity, but some of this might be used going forward. You know, it maybe make far more sense to have we call them chit chats, you know, a one-to-one with each student, you know, through Zoom. And I think especially, I think we have to remember over this next year, you know, everything I've been speaking about to my colleagues in mental health, we're going to have a very fragile population, you know, regardless, whatever size of your population looks like next year. You know, you've got a lot of people that have high levels of anxiety. They've had bereavement in their family. They're really challenged. It's going to be a really challenging year, and so having, you know, teams available to help support them, I think is really key to all this. So I would be, obviously we'll have some budgetary constraints, but you know, I think it's really essential that we really fight to recognize the impact. And also many people, even when we're told it's going to be safe, many people aren't going to feel comfortable being in groups. They're not going to be comfortable in a large social gathering. And so it may be, again, we look at the mixed model of social programming. And so it may be that you have somebody there with a GoPro that's having some kind of social event that can actually feed that live to some students that don't feel comfortable coming out, but still want to be a part of that. So I think that's really kind of essential to think about for this next year.
When you mentioned GoPro, Christopher, my first thought is we are going to be so down with the kids with tech by the time this is all over, we won't know ourselves. I'm going to quickly squeeze in one question because it is being directed at Christopher specifically. Okay. So Christopher, you've got a fan in the audience, and then we'll go to some final thoughts. So Christopher, you mentioned you had 4,500 students in room. Most of us have significantly reduced occupancy at the moment. Were students encouraged to stay, wanted to stay, or could not depart? And that comes from Edwina over in Australia.
Yes, is the answer. So all of those things. We started off with 11,000 students. As I said, we had that weekend, 3-4 days when we had many students leave. Many of our students are international students, postgraduate students, some still studying, still engaged in their student activities. We've got students who are shielding, you know, loved ones who cannot make it home for whatever reason. At the moment, it's not considered essential travel either. So the ones, you know, after they decided to stay and the restrictions were extended, they've stayed in residence. So yes, we've had a bit of everything. And I think it's important to remember as well, and I can think back to my student days. I probably wouldn't be going home either. You know, my life as living with my family had finished after I went to university, and so for many it's not really an option, like culturally, socially, and they may not even have a room to go back to if their parents have moved into a smaller house as mine did. So yeah, so I think that's really important. Is a lot of our students are independent students and living their lives, but we have a mix of all those, Edwina. So each and every one, and I wouldn't know the ratios of them, but I'd say the majority of them are probably international students at the moment, but largely post-grad.
So just conscious of time, we have a whole 4 minutes left. I don't know about you, but that hour completely flew by. Thoroughly enjoyable. I'm going to use as a final thought a question that's been posted by Jacob over in Auckland. So thank you for the inspiration, Jacob. And I'll ask each of you, how have you maintained your own self-care as leaders? What's your number one tip, hint, or trick? And we'll start with you, Marion, if that's okay.
Yeah, I read this and immediately went to the fact that for a long period of time, we couldn't go to a hairdresser, and that's just lifted. And you would not believe how good that's made me feel, having someone do my hair and stop me looking like Cruella de Vil. So that's probably my personal hit or trick. If you can get to a hairdresser, it's a good idea. But no, I think generally from my perspective, it's just focus on that positivity. I know it's really hard. I know everyone's talking about it. Don't underestimate the role we play in mental health of both our staff and our residents. And, you know, focus on the big picture. As I mentioned to the APSA members recently, you know, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in this moment of, in the moment of comfort or convenience. It's where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. And I really think as an industry, we're doing an amazing job. So we should be patting ourselves on the back at this point in time across the globe. So keeping that positivity in mind.
Absolutely. Matthew, how about you? What is your number one tip, hint, or trick?
Yeah, that's an amazing quote. I do not have a quote, but I really like that one. I'm going to come back to that.
I stole it. It was Martin Luther King, way smarter than I am, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that one. Yeah, I think, you know, I think what I would share is just routine. I think I found that to be helpful for myself. Even the routine of putting on a button-down shirt as opposed to just being in my pajamas or something like that. Having a dedicated workspace where work is happening and where home is happening, and then maintaining exercise kind of as part of that routine. You know, I think those clear distinctions between things have been really helpful, and then trying to hold that with the staff as well. And so it's so easy for work to bleed into evenings, weekends. And so as much as possible, trying to keep that contained into what might be considered a normal work schedule, even knowing that these are not normal times. But I think that's helped to keep me sane, and hopefully those boundaries helping others as well.
Excellent. I love your tip about, you know, just wearing a button-down shirt, Matthew, because every time we have a meeting with you for gin, you always look super smart, always very smart in your button-down shirts. Christopher, what about you? What's your number one tip, hint, and trick?
I'm big on putting names to things, and what we have been through and what we are going through has been traumatic, and it is a trauma, and it is impactful. And I think saying that out loud is really important, and saying it to yourself and acknowledging it to yourself. And I said this earlier, getting through every day is a victory. You know, whether you're sitting in bed eating crisps or whether you're going out and exercising your hour or a mix of in between. So really, it's really looking at this as a marathon, and we just want to get through this day. And I remember like when this kind of crisis really started to unfold for us, there's day 3 or 4 kind of into when all of our students were leaving, and we were having really being impacted, and you know, I had a little wobble, and I like Matthew, I had to have a little word for myself and suit up, you know, the next morning and put on the tie and do all that, shave, and you know, and that really kind of refocused me a little bit, and really helped me. But then it's also acknowledging that, you know, what we're going through is something that is massively intense personally and professionally, and so acknowledging that, and then just making a little plan to get through this day. So get through today, get through tomorrow, get through the next day, and beyond that, it's out of our control. So just focus on what you can control.
Absolutely, great tips from everybody, and I think I can resonate with lots of that. For me, outdoor space, getting some light, getting some exercise, walking in green space, and I think suiting up. I mean, I've got my red lippy on today, and I think that's, you know, mentally I've made an effort, so I feel good. Our time, unfortunately, is up. Like I said, that's been a really enjoyable hour, flew by. Thank you for everybody who has joined us this morning, and a big thank you to our 3 wonderful panelists. A little virtual clap for you there. And also thank you to ACUHO-I and the people behind the scenes. It is 3 a.m. over there, and they have gotten up in the middle of the night to make this happen, so we do appreciate it. Like I said, make sure you make use of all the ACUHO-I resources. There are more virtual roundtables coming up over the coming weeks, so do participate and tell all your friends about it. Thank you, guys. It's been lovely talking with you all.